Alright, kids, are you ready to hear a story? Yeah.
Welcome to Witch Toasts and Other Tales. This story is called Shadow of the Santa Claus. Once upon a time, there was this boy named Joey who lived in the suburbs. It was a nice place to grow up. Neighbors were friendly, the streets well lit, and there was no crime to speak of. Joey had lots of friends, and like most kids in the neighborhood, his parents let him stay out after dark, and he took full advantage, often going over to his friends' houses, staying for dinner, and even later. The parents all knew each other, and they'd call to make sure it was all right, and it pretty much always was. Oftentimes, Joey wouldn't head home until it was bedtime, and it was no big deal, except during Christmas time. Then, Joey was always sure to be home before dark. You see, across the street from Joey lived Old Man Jenkins. Don't misunderstand, he was a nice man, a Marine veteran, a volunteer at the local library. He went to the same church as Joey's family, and he seemed to know everybody. He lived in that house for decades. His kids had gone to the same school Joey did, though now they were grown and had families of their own. Mr. Jenkins lived alone. His wife had died around the time Joey was born. Joey's parents would invite him over for dinner once a month or so, usually after church on a Sunday. And when Joey was old enough, he started helping the old man out around the house, mainly doing a bit of yard work. Joey was usually happy to do it. The work wasn't too hard, and Mr. Jenkins paid well. But there was one call from the old man he dreaded. Each year, a few days after Thanksgiving, Mr. Jenkins would ring up Joey's parents and ask when Joey was around. He needed some help putting up his Christmas decorations. Joey couldn't really refuse. It's not like he had a good excuse, not one anyone would understand. And he really was happy to help out the rest of the year, but not now. Not in late November or early December when the call came. When he got over there, Mr. Jenkins would come outside and they would go around the side of the house where the bulkhead doors to the basement were. He would help Mr. Jenkins open them, and then they'd head down the steps into the dark and dusty cellar. The old man would turn on the light, a single incandescent bulb with a pull string, so they could see what they were looking at. Not much was down there, just Christmas decorations and yard tools, but in one corner was a statue, an 8-foot-tall statue of Santa Claus, and it terrified Joey. Ever since Joey could remember, Mr. Jenkins had put that Santa Claus up in his yard at Christmas time, and he always put it in the same place, just a few feet from the sidewalk and directly across the street from Joey's bedroom window. Right behind it was Mr. Jenkins' porch light, and so the statue cast a long shadow. When the wind blew, and it seemed to Joey sometimes even when it didn't, the statue would shake and its shadow would warble on his window pane. That had always frightened Joey, since he was very young, which he supposed was understandable, kids being afraid of the dark and such. But the real source of his fear, the real reason the Santa terrified him, was a memory. The memory is something that happened a long time ago when he was very young. The memory of a dark and stormy night. He had fallen asleep one uneventful evening, only to be woken later by the sound of screeching tires and a terrible crash. He remembered pulling down one of the blind slats and peeking out. And there, flipped over on the street, was a car right in front of his house. He squinted and tried to make out the details. The flurries were coming down thick, but he could see that there was something next to the car. Something big. A flash of lightning lit up the sky. Not something. Someone impossibly tall, someone dressed in red, someone fat, motionless in the thunder snow. And that's when he noticed Mr. Jenkins' porch light. The Santa statue in the old man's yard was missing. Joey looked back at the car, and something moved. He jumped away from the window and let out a shriek. His parents burst into the room a second later. They'd been woken by the crash, too. He remembered being very upset, and his folks trying to calm him down. He remembered hearing the police and ambulance sirens getting closer and stopping outside his house. And a couple hours later, when Joey finally went back to bed, he remembered looking out the window and seeing the Santa where it always was, right between him and Mr. Jenkins' porch light. A couple of years later, when he was older, he asked his parents what had happened that night. They said the police weren't exactly sure, but that the driver of the car had been a woman, that she'd been found outside her car, and that she'd passed away. and they reminded him to always wear his seatbelt. Now that he was older, he knew he couldn't have seen what he thought he'd seen, but his memory of that night was crystal clear. He could not convince himself to dismiss it. What had really happened that night? He didn't know, but that Santa Claus, it scared him. It was strange, too, that Mr. Jenkins kept it. It was very old. All of Mr. Jenkins' other decorations were relatively new. Christmas lights Joey helped him put up on the roof, the candy canes that lined the walk to the front door, even the sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, which were comically small next to the giant St. Nick. When December rolled around and the Santa statue went up, Joey was careful to be sure he never had to walk home alone at night. He'd never admit his fear, of course. He'd make plans to spend the night or find some excuse not to stay late at his friends' houses. Maybe it was cold, or he had homework to do, or his mom was making spaghetti, his favorite dish. But it wasn't going to be like that this year. The day after Thanksgiving, each time the phone rang, Joey felt the old, familiar dread in his stomach and listened carefully to see if it was Mr. Jenkins. And each time it happened, he got a little angrier at himself. He wasn't a little kid anymore. This whole thing was absolutely ridiculous. A kid his age, afraid of a Christmas decoration. He wasn't going to let it stop him from having fun with his friends. Well, the call finally came, and Joey headed over to Mr. Jenkins. They descended the stairs together, Joey resolved as ever to put the past behind him. But when the lights came on and the Santa stared at him from the corner, he felt his pulse quicken, and the room suddenly felt small. So he did his best to shake it off and focus on the task at hand. And by the time it came to move the Santa, he was feeling better. He grabbed the feet, Mr. Jenkins grabbed the head, and they grunted and hauled it up the stairs. It was large and pretty darn heavy. They set it up in the same spot as always, and then Joey stepped back and took a look. In the broad daylight, the statue didn't look so scary. Quite the opposite. It was jolly. The red suit with the fur trimmings, the thick black belt and bright gold buckle, the rosy cheeks, big bushy white beard, and a warm smile. Classic Kris Kringle. But the paint was faded, and it had more than a few chips. It certainly stood out next to the rest of the decorations, which couldn't be more than a decade old. Joey wondered again why Mr. Jenkins had kept it all these years. "Mr. Jenkins," he asked, "how come the Santa's so much older than all your other decorations?" Mr. Jenkins got a wistful look on his face, and he said, "Well, you see, Joey, this is a very special Santa Claus. I've had it since I was a boy. Rather, my parents had it, and they gave it to me when my kids were small. It reminds me of all the good times, all the good Christmases the Lord has blessed me with. And it's probably because of that, but sometimes when I look into its eyes, I could almost swear they twinkle back at me. A bit of Christmas magic, perhaps." He gave a little chuckle and smiled. Joey guessed he had a doubtful look because Mr. Jenkins asked, "What's the matter? Don't you believe in Christmas magic?" Joey said, "I'm too old to believe in Santa Claus." Mr. Jenkins laughed. "Oh, you're never too old for that." A few nights later, it was Friday night, and Joey's friend Billy invited him over to watch a movie and stay for dinner. Billy's mom was cooking spaghetti, Joey's second favorite spaghetti in the whole world, after his own mother's, of course. Billy immediately thought of the statue, but then pushed it out of his mind. Easy to do in the bright light of day there on the school playground, and said, "I'd love to come over." He went home after school, finished his chores, then left for Billy's, being sure to pull on his jacket as he left. It was going to get much colder when the sun went down, when Joey walked back home at night, alone. So he walked over to Billy's. He lived just a couple of streets over and had a great time. The movie was good, the dinner even better. And while he was there, the sun set, the sky darkened, clouds gathered, and the temperature dropped. When it was nearing time to leave, Joey looked outside at the darkness, and a sense of foreboding fell over him. He did his best to ignore it, but still, he found himself looking for excuses to stay just a little bit longer. But eventually, there were no more excuses. It was time to go home. Joey said goodbye to Billy and his family. He thanked them for inviting him over, and Billy's mother in particular for the delicious pasta. Then he pulled on his jacket and went out the front door just as the snow began to fall. Joey walked slowly at first. He couldn't help thinking of what lay ahead. But as he went along, he realized it wasn't really that dark after all. The streetlights were on. They lit the streets up pretty nicely. He remembered that there was a street lamp in front of the house next door to his own. It would be nice and bright there. He was being silly, acting like a little kid, picked up the pace, and soon turned the corner onto his own street. He couldn't help it. His eyes were drawn to the Santa. There it stood, halfway down the street, motionless in Old Man Jenkins' yard. It was quite late, just after 10 o'clock. The street was deserted. Joey thought of how foolish he was to linger at Billy's. If he'd left right after dinner, there probably would have been somebody outside, bringing home groceries or salt in their driveway. The snow fell a little heavier. It reminded him of a different snowy night, and he felt a lump in his throat. Joey realized he was just standing there and started walking again. His eyes returned to Mr. Jenkins' yard every couple of steps. He got closer. He could now see Mr. Jenkins' porch light and the long shadow of the Santa stretching across the street and onto his bedroom window. He got closer and closer to his house, closer and closer to the Santa, and with each step he felt a little more fear, a little more panic. He wanted to run, to sprint for his front door, but he resisted the urge and forced himself to walk. He kept telling himself it was all in his head, that he had nothing to fear, that he was being a baby. When he was 3 doors down, a gust of wind came through, and the Santa statue began to rock back and forth. Joey lost it. The panic he'd stuffed down came right back up, and he started to run, his eyes glued to the statue. He ran beneath the street light in front of the house next to his own, and then something grabbed his jacket. His back leg came up, and he tried to catch himself on his front foot, but it slipped. A freshly fallen snow. Bam! He hit the sidewalk hard, landing right on his elbow. Ouch! He groaned and rolled onto his back. Lights flooded him from the far end of the street. As a car turned onto it, Joey looked to see what he'd caught his jacket on. It was the hedgerow. They were overgrown. The couple that used to live there had moved out a couple of months ago. Whoever bought the place hadn't moved in yet, and the yard had gone untended. And he hadn't been paying attention, just staring at that stupid Santa. His fear was gone now, and he just felt silly and a lot of pain. He sat up and started rubbing his elbow. The car's bright headbeams lit up the street, and Joey was grateful for it. It slowed as it got closer, then came to a stop beside him, and the window rolled down. The man inside the car asked, "You out there?" That looked like a pretty nasty fall. Joey got to his feet. He didn't recognize the man in the car, but there was concern on his face, and he seemed friendly enough. "Oh, yes, sir," he said. "Or I will be. Should have been paying better attention, I guess." "You all right to get home?" the man asked. "Yeah, I'll be fine. I'll just live right there," Joey said, pointing. "Well, all right. Have a good night," the man said, and drove off. Joey hobbled the rest of the way, not even thinking about the Santa now, just feeling ashamed at his own childness. He didn't even believe in the actual Santa Claus anymore. It was time he stopped believing in haunted statues, too. A few nights later, Joey's friend Ethan rushed up to him on the playground. "Guess what? Guess what?" he demanded. "What is it?" Joey asked. "You know the new space pirate game? I got it." "What?" Joey said. "How'd you convince your parents?" "I'm just that good." Ethan smiled and laughed. "Want to come over tonight and play it?" "You bet," Joey said excitedly. He didn't even think about the Santa statue. Not for the rest of the school day, not when he got home, not when he was doing his homework, not even when he left his house to walk to Ethan's, not when they were picking up space girls and stealing space cars, not when he said goodbye to Ethan and his family well past 10 o'clock, not even when he left and started walking home, trudging through the sludge, snow piled high on either side and more falling. He was a big kid now. He'd put all that behind him. And then he turned onto his deserted street and saw only darkness. Well, not exactly. There were porch lights and a couple of street lamps, but the street light right near his house was out. A puddle of darkness surrounded it, including all the nearby houses and, of course, the Santa Claus. Was the statue even there anymore? He squinted, but there was no way he could tell. His old, familiar fears crept in. A chill went down his spine. He fought to keep out the memory of all those years ago, of the great hulking figure standing over the burning wreck. Fought to stop himself from imagining the woman who died that day and what might have happened that night. Then he grew angry at himself again and forced his feet forward. As he walked, he cast furtive glances from side to side. Was there something in the shadows behind that bush, behind that tree, in that narrow space between the fences? He got closer and closer to his house. Joey strained his eyes, searching for the Santa, but the night was too dark, the snow too thick and heavy. He was 7 doors down, 5 doors down, 3 doors down. Wait, what was that? Just a parked car in front of the house next to his own. What about the yard of that house? It had no lights, and the hedgerow was thick. Was that a shadow there, behind the bushes? Could it be an 8-foot-tall Santa Claus? A sound above him startled him, and he let out a gasp. Crow flew out of the tree branches that hung overhead and took off into the night. Joey shook his head and laughed at himself. And a laugh was just what he needed. His fear faded and he smiled. Who cared if the statue was there or not? If it was, what was it going to do to him? Attack him? And if it wasn't, it had probably fallen over and broken. Mr. Jenkins had put it back inside the basement, or put it in the house, or, better yet, finally put it next to the garbage bins in his garage to be taken out with the trash. Still chuckling to himself, he continued along the hedgerow. A sack dropped over his head, and something big and strong grabbed him from behind. Joey tried to cry out, but a firm hand pressed something against his face. It had a strange smell, and he immediately felt lightheaded. His feet were lifted off the ground. Someone or something had picked him up and was carrying him. He tried to breathe, but the odor overwhelmed him, and everything seemed distant, even his sense of panic. He fell, but not far, and not onto the concrete, but something soft. There was a slamming sound, and the sound of the wind and snow faded. Where was he? He tried to scream through the haze, but he wasn't sure anything came out. He wanted to reach up and pull the sack off his head, but his arms were weak and sluggish, his hands clumsy and awkward. He couldn't even sit up. In fact, he could hardly move at all. Then he heard a sound, sort of strangled, garbled cry, and through the thick haze that had settled over his senses, he thought he heard a deep voice say, "Naughty." A moment later, he heard, and the sack came off his head. He was still dazed, and everything was blurry, but after a moment, his eyes focused. He was in a trunk, and standing over him was the Santa statue. He recoiled, but realized there was nowhere to go. He desperately wanted to get out, to run to his house, to get away from the statue. But though his senses were returning, he could still barely move. The statue wasn't moving at all, so he continued to fight through the fear and try to clear his mind. After a minute, he was able to sit up and steady himself, one hand on the edge of the trunk. He swung his legs over the side and they hit something on the ground. He almost fell, but moved his feet to the side onto solid ground and finally stood up. Joey looked down. A man was lying on the ground. A man he recognized. It was the same man who had asked him if he was all right after he'd fallen the other night. He took another look at the car. It was the same car. Now he understood. Joey looked into the face of St. Nicholas. He didn't know what to say. Merry Christmas, he finally stuttered, and he could have sworn there was a twinkle in Santa's eye. Then he jogged as fast as he dared up to his front door, nearly falling over, shouting, "Help! Help!" as he opened it. He glanced back just before he slammed the door and locked it. The Santa statue was back across the street in its old, familiar place. Joey's parents called the police as he explained about the man in the street. They arrived soon after and found the man who tried to kidnap Joey. Turns out, this wasn't the first time he'd gone after a kid, but it was the last. His parents were worried about him that night, worried he wouldn't be able to sleep, especially not in his own room near the window. But Joey assured them he would be fine. He looked out his window just before he fell asleep, looked at the shadow of the Santa Claus. Maybe old man Jenkins was right. Maybe Christmas magic was real. Maybe you never were too old to believe in Santa Claus. One thing's for sure, though. Joey slept like a baby. The end.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe.